We don't have too many longhorn cattle in Devon, so I've used Pixabay, which is a free reference photo website, royalty free, and I found a nice picture of a Texas Longhorn, so I'm using that as my reference. And as I often do, I'm using a watercolour marker. This is a blue marker, and mixed media paper. This particular paper is A3 in size, so double the size that I use when I'm typically painting outside. And as you can see, I'm just putting in a loose indication of the head of the animal. So these huge horns, I've tried to keep the lines, flowing and fairly loose, because we can always make minor adjustments later on in the process. And the key I find when I'm drawing animals is, or anything really, is to try and keep things very, very simple at the early stages. And really, if you can follow that rule, keep things simple throughout the painting, that generally produces better results than trying to depict every single detail. So what I do when I look at an animal like this, it's quite a complex set of shapes, but I just try and bolt it all together with as few lines as possible and still capture what's going on. So I will look at the torso of the animal and think, well, which lines do I actually need to include at this stage? What's the minimum I can do? And this is quite a quick process. You can see my pen nib going back and forth as I work away. We don't have to get it exactly right, as I mentioned a moment ago. But I am taking little measurements as I go. So, for example, when I draw the belly or the position of this leg I'm putting in now, I'll look at my reference and say to myself, well, is that leg directly below the tip of the right hand horn, or is it slightly to the left? And again, I don't need to replicate the photograph exactly, but we want this thing to look fairly realistic, albeit in a stylized way. The other route you can go, of course, if you do want to depict something which is a near perfect replica of your reference, then you can simply overlay a grid of squares on top of the reference photograph, and you can simply grid up your drawing and do it that way if you prefer. I don't like working that way. I feel I lose some of the spontaneity in my work if I do that. Plus, it's much more time consuming, I think, to do it that way. But you can see now we've got a reasonable outline of this animal, a reasonable sense of movement of this steer on its way from right to left, and I'm just making some additional adjustments to the line of the head here, kind of refining the lines. Minor adjustments being made to the side of the head there. And there's always a little bit of a balance to strike. So, for example, you can see that I've increased the size of the snout and the length of the head quite dramatically there from what I had before. I obviously didn't measure that quite right the first time round. So that's an alteration which definitely needed to be included. However, I don't want to get too caught up in trying to perfect everything at this stage, because undoubtedly as the painting progresses, I'll change my mind on certain things. And that's usually because when you put one colour next to another or one tone next to another, you find it, or for me, I find that it doesn't work always in the same way that I had in my head. Sometimes it will work much, much better than I thought it was going to, and other times not so great. But what I did just a moment ago was spray the surface of the painting with water, and that just helps the acrylic paint that I'm using. So I'm using the Atelier interactive acrylics, as I often do. And just that little spray of water onto the mixed media paper, it just helps that first layer of paint flow rather more easily than if you were going straight onto dry paper. Now, the other thing I'll often do is I'll coat the paper at times with conventional acrylic, and then painting on top of that dry surface. That really helps the paint glide. But this is a pretty good quick way of doing it as well. So as I'm popping in this first layer of colour, I'm keeping the paint quite thin so the brush marks are still apparent. And as you can see, I'm beginning to get a sense of 3 dimensions because the brush strokes that I've used describe the shape of the animal. So there's a nice curved arcs of brush stroke around the belly of the animal, and then around the neck, and the legs, I'll use brush strokes in different directions to depict whatever is going on. Now, while I'm doing this, I'm also, as I work around the animal, I'm still checking the lines that I put down originally. So in many cases, hopefully, I've done a reasonable job, and I'll more or less be colouring in the sense that I won't be changing the outline of the shape I've got. But in other areas, there will be mistakes, and so I'll correct those as I go. So no matter which stage of the painting I'm in, I'm constantly looking with a critical eye, trying to optimise the image. And sometimes actually I quite like to leave a painting just with one layer of paint and some line work. Sometimes that spontaneous reaction to a subject, it's far more powerful than something you've laboured over. But this is a rather lovely orangey brown I feel I've got here, and the palette I'm using today for the most part is titanium white, cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue, and then brilliant magenta. So rather than use a red at this early stage, having the magenta and the yellow allow me to mix up a whole range of different reds and oranges. And it's a good way to sort of make you consider, well, what kind of red do I want here? And then, of course, once you've got an orange, you can add a touch of blue, and then that orange starts to become a brown. So by having the magenta and the yellow, and then adding a touch of blue, you can really start to play around with all the different types of brown that you can imagine, really. So while I was chatting away there, you can see I've filled in the area of most of the head, and now I'm coming in with a deeper shadow colour. This is kind of a purpley brown, although as you can see it really is quite purpley, so I guess it's more of a browny purple perhaps is a better phrase. And I'm gently blocking in the main areas of deep shadow on the animal. So the animal's head, the cow's head, is casting a shadow down across its chest, and the underside of the belly is also in shadow. So again, keeping in mind the direction of the brush strokes. And while I'm there with that colour of paint, the tail is mostly in shadow as well, or has some shadow areas at least, so it's good to put down a bit of shadow. And having this wet surface, which I just refreshed with the spray bottle, again, it keeps the paint just a little bit fluid and makes for more expressive marks. And you can see I'm adding a little bit more water to the surface there as well. The spray bottle's really good though. It tends to minimise the risk of drenching the paper. Now the cast shadow from the head, which extends onto the right hand foreleg, that curve of that shadow again helps to describe the three-dimensional nature of the upper leg, the cylindrical form you've got there. So again, I'm keeping things fairly simple. Not including the outlines, I've only used 2 colours so far. We're getting a little bit of mixing of colour with the interactive acrylics. When you put wet onto fresh paint, they do mix together in a rather lovely way. You don't want to overdo that mixing, you don't want the colours to get muddy, but if you're fairly gentle and considered, then it usually works really quite well. Now I've run out of paint on the tip of the bristles of the brush now, so I'm using a little bit of a dry brush technique to add some shadows on the horns. You can see, again, I've created a 3D effect, and simply leaving the underlying paper showing through helps to create the illusion of light falling on top of the cow, on top of the steer. And again, I've popped in some little shadow areas for the eye and a shadowy region for the nose as well. And still going with that same colour, just putting in the cast shadow that the animal is creating on the ground. And again, within the shadows we can have a range of different tones and brush strokes, and we can use those to depict what's going on the ground. So very rare that a cow is going to be standing on a completely level, mirror smooth finish. So generally speaking, the shadows that they cast are going to be wobbly. As you can see, those 2 branches coming out forwards represent the shadows that the horns are casting on the ground. And you can see how I've deliberately broken up the shadow of the right hand branch there. So all of these little things help to create the illusion that the animal is occupying a space somewhere in nature. there's a little bit of a randomness to it. So I've added quite a lot of white to some magenta, probably a little bit of yellow in here if memory serves me correctly, and I'm using that for the highlight colours on top of the animal's body. And once again, staying with that same colour, the idea is to move around and across the animal using that colour as widely as possible. So certainly don't want to force a colour into a place where it doesn't work. But, while that colour's mixed up and while it's on the brush, why not put it everywhere it needs to be? Now, of course, what does tend to happen once in a while, at least with me, is that I think I've done it all, and then 10 minutes later I realise, I could have used that colour over there as well. So, none of these things are perfect, or very rarely. But in general, just keeping things simple, so one colour at a time, cover as much of the area as possible, tends to bring the animal to life fairly quickly. If you go with a mid-tone, a dark tone for the shadows, and then a lighter tone for the highlights, just those 3 simple steps, you begin to create something which looks fairly reasonable fairly quickly.